It's a bit interesting. I'm on a panel. We got a spectrum that's represented by the members of the panel. Judge Thompson is on one end of that spectrum, having been somebody who has sent people to prison and chosen not to send people to prison. And then within the spectrum, we have academics and scholars and lawyers who have thought deeply about these issues for years. And I'm on the other end of the spectrum, usually not invited into the discussion. I am the person who has actually served time in prison, who recognizes those cells not because I've seen them in magazines and books, not because I visited clients there. I recognize it because I've been there. I struggle with how to introduce myself in any space, whether it is here or in a prison. Do I say my name is Reginald Dwayne Betts, and I am a poet and a lawyer that I graduated from Yale Law School? Do I list my accolades, or do I say my name is Reginald Dwayne Betts, and I was sent to prison when I was 16 years old after I was arrested and confessed and pled guilty to carjacking? It is quite amazing how people think of you differently when you have degrees behind your name. They tell you, I can't believe they sent you to prison. Even if you are in a room with everybody in 1996, more than 95% of the people in any room that I've been in 1996, they might not have thought I should have been in prison. That most of them wouldn't have stood up and say, I shouldn't have been in prison. I only know it because back then, me and my friends would write lawyers and try to get them to take on our cases. Try to get them to care about what it means to be a juvenile sentenced to 30, 40, 50 years in prison. And nobody responded. And one of the deeply emotional things I feel on a day like this is wondering where the voices were who cared before. It always makes me ask this fundamental question. What do you think about when you hear the word prison? See, some of us think about violence, or we think about injustice. We think about the tragedy of it all. If you know somebody who's been inside, you think about maybe how long it takes to get from a home to a prison cell where you're hugging a loved one. If you've been inside, you think about time. But I tell people, when I hear the word prison, I think about books. And to make you understand where I'm coming from, I have to take you back to the summer of 1998, when my world looked like this. It was complete darkness. I was in solitary confinement. I should have been contemplating graduating from high school. I should have been thinking about college, but instead, I was discovering Buju Banton as one of my homeboys banged on his cell door late into the night and chanted, "Murderer, blood is on your shoulder." I was in one of these old school prisons where the cells were parallel, and they stretched down a corridor as long as the Atlantic. I would stand at my cell door and listen to men shout from 6 a.m. until 6 a.m. I called myself learning how to do a bid. One day I heard a man call out, "Hey, yo, send me a book." And I was perplexed because books were contraband in a hole. They took all of my books away when they threw me in that cell. And then I heard it, swish, a paperback sliding across concrete. A day or so later, I hear it again. "Hey, yo, send me a book with cell 15. Swish. And if it was a magazine, it sounded damn near like bird wings flapping. Swish. But I was a teenager in prison. I was told by the nurse, you don't ask men in prison for anything. Not cigarettes, not food, not safety, not solace, that it was dangerous in those cells. But I was lonely, and so I found myself calling out, "Hey, yo, send me a book." The call came back, "Young blood with cell." I was in like cell 21, and a book came, and it landed in my hands, and it was Dudley Randall's The Black Poets, and it offered me some light. It was like a vision into what tomorrow might look like. I listened to us talk about prison, and what we talk about is the injustice. What we talk about is the desperation. But rarely, like listening to Bree Williams, do we talk about the people inside prison. But rarely do we talk about what we might do to change the actual lives inside of a prison. I started an organization called Freedom Reads to build libraries in prison. And the first thing people told me is, why would you do something like that? I said, we're going to bring beautiful things inside of a prison. And I was told, why would you try to bring beauty inside of a prison by people who have never spent a day inside of a prison cell? They told me that the COs would not go for it. And they said, how will you do it anyway? Even after I got $5 million from the Mellon Foundation, they said, this is an absurd idea. I said, we're going to make it out of hardwood. You looked at the photos up here that stretch back centuries, and all you see is metal and plastic. I have actually been in one of those kennels when I was 16 years old and sent to solitary confinement for 6 months. And I went inside that kennel faithfully 3 times a week because I was afraid of what would happen without light. And I told people we were going to build these libraries. We were going to make the modules 44 inches high. Why? Why would we make a module 44 inches high? Because the Prison Rape Elimination Act says that if it is taller, that the very existence of the thing threatens the safety of the people inside. The dilemma is, how do you have a conversation about the injustice of the system while admitting that you were afraid when you were in a cell? And how do you admit to an audience that the thing that you want to do is not to write a paper that will get you tenure? The truth is, I'm only here by happenstance. How do I admit that? That I'm only here because the insistence on me not having a job because of my criminal record from August liberal institutions, that insistence that I was not worthy of an interview drove me to law school, which is a particular kind of desperation. We partnered with Mass Design, and we decided that we were going to do this thing. And I realized that I had to partner with the DOC to make it happen. My first presentation about this work was not to an academic institution. It was to the Corrections Leaders Association. I should thank Professor Reginald, because she's the first person that gave me the idea that COs were people. I was working with her on one of these solitary projects, and all of the, not all of them, but a number of commissioners and executive directors of the DOC would come to Yale to actually engage in conversation. And I thought, damn, they have 10 fingers just like I do, 10 toes as well. And maybe they haven't been a source of relief in my life in the past, but maybe they could be a source in changing what this system looks like in the today. I remember being on a conversation with the superintendents in Massachusetts, and I had one that was really committed to bringing the Freedom Libraries into the space. And when we showed him the modules, and that we needed 6 by 10 feet of space, he said, so you just been wasting my time? Because I don't have that much space in this prison. And I said, well, wait, we can make it happen in 3 feet of space. Just tell me how much space you have, and we'll make it happen. And then he said, okay, what if we gutted out a prison cell? And I said, bet. And that became the site of the first Freedom Library. This was about a year ago today. When I went in to talk to the guys after we installed it, it was on December 9th. I remember it because it was 25 years to the day that I woke up in a prison for the first time. Since that moment, we've built 50 Freedom Libraries. Just this week, and I am like deeply exhausted, right? Because on Tuesday and Wednesday, Tuesday morning, I flew to Baton Rouge That afternoon, we drove to Dixon Correctional Center. I turned my last book, Felon, into a solo piece of theater, and I've given you 5 minutes of it to start this talk. In Dixon Correctional Center, I spoke in front of an audience that was just as large as this, filled with men who had done 10 and 15 and 20 years in prison. Moments before I spoke to them, we had installed these walnut shelves and these 500 books into that space. And I talked to them about why I was there. The next morning, it was 8 o'clock, and I was devastated to learn that Louisiana is quite cold in November at 8 o'clock in the morning. But I was at the rodeo, and I was on the stage, and there was a couple hundred people from 3 different prisons, including the women's prison, that was there to hear me do my thing. We had installed 3 libraries at Angola. It was wild because when we walked in, the 2 men who had built the libraries, 2 of the 3 who had built these libraries, one guy had did 25 years in prison at Angola. We came back on a compound, and he is holding these libraries, and people see him, and they're calling out his name, and they're giving him dap, and they're hugging him. They remind me of something that we forget. People live whole entire lives in prison, and we forget about them. I think the thing that I've learned most, the thing that I've become to appreciate most in doing this work, is that we have to figure out what is the medium between analyzing the problem and showing up for the people who are still suffering. In 1996, I had friends who were locked up with me. They are still locked up today. And so when I think about Michelle Alexander's The New Jim Crow, I think about all that hasn't changed. And I think about every conversation that we are not having about the lives of men and women who are locked up right now, who were locked up 5 years ago, and who likely will be locked up 5 years from now. It's exciting to be here part of this conversation, given that it is the first time that this august body of intellectuals have thought about mass incarceration in such a public space. But what I would ask us all is how much of our thinking will even be targeted at relieving the suffering of somebody that's inside right now. I am optimistic mostly because I know that it was a federal judge who was just sitting in this space who hired me. And I remember somebody called him and said, "Judge, the background check of your new law clerk came in. It's something that we should talk about." "Yeah, I seen his background check. I think we're good." No. I don't know if you've seen the latest copy of the background check." The person on the phone was afraid to say, "Do you know your law clerk is a convicted felon, and I don't know if he should be in this courtroom." And my judge says, "I know exactly who I hired, and he is welcome here just like everybody else." Thank you.
And so we welcome questions for a few minutes before we take the bus. Comments or questions?
Say your name. Yeah. My name is Jack Liu from Michigan. Those are fantastic talks, very inspiring stories from the presentation on Zoom. And it's very important issue. Personally, I actually did my research on a correction farm when I was a master's student doing ecological research, right? Work with prisoners, and they actually, during the day, they work on the farm and make a living out of it, rather than stay in isolated tiny rooms. And I thought that was actually good for them to get some sunlight and fresh air, and get some physical exercise and help them mentally as well. So I'm an ecologist by training. So my question to you is that I have not done research on the environmental ecological impact of prisoner systems. You have talked about a lot of social, political, economic dimensions. I think that's very important. My question to you is, are you aware of any research on environmental impact of prisoner system? Because climate change is a big issue, right? So if you take a person from a home, then you reduce the number of people in that household. That actually increases the resource use per person. Because when you have more people in a household, then you have more people to share the same resource. When you turn on the light or turn the heat, the same people use the same amount of, the different number of people use the same amount of energy, right? This is a kind of maybe a little bit different from what you have been talking about, but I'm just trying to take a different perspective on that issue. Thank you.
Andrea is going to start because Angola is the site of very vivid litigation about its lack of safety in terms of heat, because that's one piece, and then we'll talk a little about what it would mean to have green prisons. But first.
Yeah. So there are studies. So there's a couple of different studies. So on the one end, there have been studies looking at the construction of prisons and the use of concrete and the ways in which the construction of the prisons actually contribute to global warming and the environment. There's another kind of category of studies around the location and the siting of prisons and jails on less desirable land, often because they are near super toxic sites and et cetera. But there's an emerging body of scholarship around thinking about incarcerated people as the most vulnerable to climate change, in part because of the building construction and the ways in which that those materials retain heat. And so there's been some litigation around death row and the impact of that heat, particularly on people who are on certain prescription medications and how that increases the risk. But also because all of the ways that you and I are told to adapt and to mitigate in the face of climate change, they are legally prohibited from doing so. And so they are both more exposed with less of an ability to adapt in the ways that you and I are encouraged to. And so that third category, I think, is really emerging as one of the kind of most compelling areas thinking about climate change and what our responsibility for each other should be.
And to invite, of course, architects and engineers into the conversation. The American Institute of Architecture in 2020, persuaded by a group called Responsible Design, Planning, and Architecture, have an ethics statement that they will no longer build solitary confinement, that architects should no longer participate in designing new solitary confinement cells. So the question about where this multidisciplinary activity of putting people into a thing called a prison, and what I hope people have been able to see is how bizarre and unnatural it is as a way of human functioning. And the deeper I get into solitary, the more it's like, we all move physically. 5 steps, 10 steps, all of us here. And yet in our name, hundreds of thousands of people have been told with different degrees of lockdown that they can't move. And so it's sort of, whipping becomes the easy, oh, we don't whip, but we hope one can see what we collectively do to try to understand both its resiliency in a wave of deinstitutionalization, and then whether its resiliency is coming to an end, and what are the various forms of comment, critique, and social movement politics that would help undo what should be seen as a radical and bizarre act. And there's some really creepy Supreme Court discussions about normal versus atypical, and solitary is normal. So this is an invitation to think about what's normal in the world we inhabit, and then to think about what world we want to inhabit. I know we have to catch our bus. Yes, Linda Kerber. And then Linda Greenhouse. The last 2 questions come from
Real quick, it's for Reginald. Bets, can you tell us something about the specific books that you put in your prison libraries, or the kind of books that you find welcome there?
It would be such a long conversation, but I will say it's 500 books, and it's, you know, you got Don Quixote, you got James Baldwin, you got Toni Morrison. About 15% of the collection is in Spanish. Some books that have been translated. I mean, some books that have English translations, but also some of the contemporary Spanish novels that have no English translations. You got classics, but ultimately you got a wide range, and the notion is, what does it mean to imagine that 500 books could carry you through a serious period of time and give you a wide range of different ways of viewing the world? But I mean, ultimately, I think the books are the books that we have on our shelves. I don't lean heavily towards academic books. I like academic books myself, but I don't know if anybody wants to read Foucault, and I don't have really books about, you know, mass incarceration generally, because again, I don't have books where you got to read a run of 6 or 7 books to really understand the issue. I have books that contain a world within themselves, and I lean towards stories and I lean towards literature. But it's 500 wide-ranging books that when people look at them, they say, "Oh, I had that book. I read that," and that's what I hope for. Oh, like I've heard of that and I want to read that. So,
Bernard?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting how Foucault always kind of appears as this specter.
And
But I'll
are you
just
going to
say
say
one
this in
thing.
French
I'll
or
just say one
English?
thing. No, I'll just say one thing. And I don't translate Foucault, actually. I edit Foucault. I don't translate. It's much more complicated to translate. But I'll just say this. For an instance of people who might want to read Foucault, the Short Corridor Collective was a collective of men in isolation at San Quentin, I think it was. They were the leaders of the largest racial gangs, supposedly. And they didn't have access to any books, actually. And they started a process of swishing contraband. And it was Foucault, Discipline and Punish. It was Bobby Sands, and a lot of other works that were particularly stimulating to them, that actually led to the largest prison hunger strike in the country, in California, in 2011, that they organized as a result of the process of reading those books.
I read
Right.
those joints. They didn't lead me to lead a hunger strike, so.
30,000 men and women went on a hunger strike in California in 2011 as a result of the wonderful work of reading books.
And Dwayne's project is called Freedom Reads. Linda?
Question for Professor Harcourt. Based on your experience, I assume, in visiting clients in Rikers Island. So,
Students.
you know, the image we're left with from Bree Williams' presentation about these correctional officers who, you know, they've seen the light, and it was very stirring and, you know, wonderful. But thinking about at least what I've read about Rikers Island and the culture of the guards there, who are protected by their union, which is deeply embedded in New York politics and is protected by the politicians of New York City. So here we have, I mean, that was a very nice image, but what happens in prisons is not just what happens in prisons, it's embedded in the political culture of the place. And I just would be interested in your responding to that from your Rikers experience.
Right. Well, so I would say that the largest force in kind of lack of correctional reform, et cetera, is the guard union in New York City. And actually on solitary confinement, they've been leading a campaign against solitary confinement. There were hearings about 2 months ago at the New York City Council, and it became actually very confrontational and difficult outside because of the resistance to any kind of reforms on solitary confinement coming from the guard union. So that is an extraordinary force in New York City, leading to resistance to closing Rikers and resistance to other forms. But as in every area, you know, it's person by person, and I think that was in part something that we saw from Dr. Williams, something we heard from Dwayne Betts, and something I've experienced as well. Some extraordinary people on the inside also trying to take care of Ms. Cotton in Rosie's at Rikers is just an extraordinary person in charge of the educational wing right there, and really dedicated and just an extraordinary person. So, you know, it's always kind of a person to person. On the other hand, I think the images and the deaths that are now at what, 14 or 15? I don't know what number we're at right now.
Right.
Something like 15 deaths
At Rikers.
of persons incarcerated at Rikers this year, right? I mean,
So you take people who are challenged, and we heard some mentally ill, you put them in a terrible metal box with other people who are often untrained and ill-prepared, and you end up not only replicating violence, but inspiring new and difficult violence. And so the question of how to to end that form of violence, one is to stop thinking about it. It's a safe place where we're in control and discipline. No, maybe it could get safer if you had a sense of joint venturing, of living in a community together as you were trying to help people function. So the dysfunction of the current system is powerfully mapped, and the question about where are the roads to get to more function embedded in New York City politics and in the national political scene and the international scene as well. And so the site, there's a thing called prison tourism, and some prisons have tourism as in, look, the Birdman of Alcatraz, you can see him here. Or so, I mean, this is the cell. Eastern State Penitentiary, to which we will go shortly, is dedicated to helping people understand both its history and the current problems of incarceration in an effort to continue this conversation. Annie has held up the stop sign. So we have to stop this form of it, but the goal, both in the buses and the place, and then in dinner thereafter, is to continue this conversation. I need to thank my colleagues and friends, because I am very grateful that you all came to join, and I am grateful that you're in the world doing the work you're doing. Thank you very much.
thank you, Judith.
Thank you, Judith.